Hello, this is Professor Brown Cedarberg, and we're going to spend some time talking about constructors. Now, we remember that we create instances of a class with this line. We specify the type of the instance, the class that will be an instance of, the name we want to assign to that instance, the assignment operator, the keyword new, repetition of the type, and then open and close parentheses, and, if appropriate, arguments within those parentheses. Now, what we're doing with that new type and the open and close parentheses is actually calling a constructor that will actually make the instance of the class. The constructor actually creates the instance. Now, constructors are methods. They are the first methods that should be included with a class. They execute only at the time of the creation of an instance. They can't be called directly. They execute that one time and then they're done. They only execute at the time an instance is created. They can't be called directly, but they can and should be overloaded. Now, the rules of a constructor are simple. First, a constructor must always have the same name as the class in which it resides. It is always public. It is always non-static. It has no return type, not even void, and it must give a value to each and every instance variable. These are the rules of constructors. Same name as the class, public, non-static, no return type, and it must give a value to each and every instance variable. Now, the default constructor is a constructor that has an empty parameter list. It is inherited from the ancestor class, going all the way up to the class object. We should override the default constructor with our own. And remember, a default constructor is a constructor that has an empty parameter list. Now, a non-default constructor has a non-empty parameter list. It looks for some values to be passed to it. If you have a non-default constructor, you must have a default constructor. So if you have any non-default constructors, you have to have the default. You should always have a default, no matter what. So here's an example of some constructors. We've got a class stock item. It has two public instance variables, and we know we should always make our instance variables private, but we'll, just from this demonstration, we'll keep them public. And we've got two constructors. Remember, they're both public. They both have the same name as the class in which they reside. They're non-static, and they have no return type, not even void. And so the default looks for no arguments to be passed to it, and what it does is it gives a value to the instance variables, and the instance variables in this class are the int number and the string description. And you'll see that the default constructor gives the values to each of those. We have a non-default constructor. It's public, non-static, no return type, stock item, and it looks for two arguments to be passed into it. An int that will refer to as number passed, and a string it will refer to as description passed. And it will save those values passed in to the instance variables that are a part of this class. So each and every instance variable in both the default and the non-default constructors is given a value. So that's a default and a non-default constructor, very simple. Now, here we'll demonstrate constructors, remembering that we have those constructors in our stock item. Here's a class demo stock item. Within our main method, we are creating two instances of the class stock item. The first, foo, is created through calling the default constructor. The second, bar, is called by calling the non-default constructor that looks for an int and then a string to be passed into it. Here we've created two instances of the class stock item, one named foo, one named bar. One was created through calling the default constructor, the other by calling the non-default constructor, passing the arguments as expected, an int and then a string. Now, when we're working with constructors, we're very often working in classes that extend another class, and this is where we're talking about inheritance. When we have a class that is an extension of another class, that is a subclass of another, we should put in our constructors, default and non-default, a call to the constructor of the parent class. We do that with the line super, open and close parentheses, and then our semicolon. And this is a call to the default constructor, if it's super, open and close parentheses, a call to the constructor of the parent class. We should always have that as the first line of our constructor. Now, be it a call to the default constructor of our parent class or the non-default constructor, we should always call the constructor of our parent class. That should be the first line of our method, our constructor method, if our class extends any other class. Now, we know that all classes extend the class object. So if our class is really the first class we are defining, we should just call super, and that will call the constructor for the default class, which is the class object. As we are extending other classes, we'll certainly call super so that we're creating an instance of the class that's a parent of the class we're creating. So the way we call the constructors in the parent class is simply with the word super, open and close parentheses, passing arguments if appropriate, not passing if appropriate. So what we've talked about today are constructors. And we create an instance of a class with the executable line of code that specifies the type of the instance we want to create, that is the class, the name we want to assign to that instance, the assignment operator, which allows us to take what's on the right side, and that is the actual creation of the instance of the class, and that's created with the keyword new, a repetition of the type, and then open and close parentheses and a semicolon, and an argument's passed in within those parentheses if appropriate. Now, constructors are methods. They are usually, or they should always be, the first methods in a class. They execute once at the time of creation of the instance. They cannot be called from the outside. They can't be called directly inside or outside. They only fire with the use of that keyword new. They can and should be overloaded. And we call the constructor of a parent class to our class, through super and then an open and close parentheses, semicolon, and any arguments if appropriate within those parentheses. You'll work quite a bit with constructors as you create new classes. You should always have constructors in your classes, if nothing more than just a default constructor. Thank you very much.